Welcome to the Apocalyptic Supperclub, nourishment for dire times, where I serve up stories to whet the appetite for the politically possible and nourish our capacity to show up more fully in a drastically changing world. Because we need stories that do more than inform. They also need to remind us that we are an important part of the solution, and they need to show us pathways to step into our role as changemakers while taking good care of ourselves and each other along the way. Today on the Apocalyptic Supperclub, we are going to dive into the myriad ways Americans can powerfully protect our First Amendment rights through the help of a brilliant organization called EveryLibrary, a nonprofit that helps ordinary Americans on the ground who want to protect these rights do so with proven skills, resources, and strategies that work. So first, the bad news. The right-wing extremists in power are systematically seeking to undermine our library and information systems that, for more than 100 years, have served the people and functioned as pillars of our First Amendment rights and our ability to think critically by being well-informed. Authoritarian-leaning extremists started with empowering individual resistance in the form of parent-led book bans, as well as the personal harassment of librarians, all under the pretext of protecting children from obscenity. Today, their tactics have evolved into passing legislation at the state level that criminalizes ordinary librarian duties and redefines the fundamental premise and purpose that libraries serve. If these attacks alarm you, as it does many, meet your library champion, EveryLibrary, whose motto is a true collective vision. Any library initiative anywhere matters to every library everywhere. Founded in 2012, its emergence was a rebel moment in the library world. It was born out of the realization that while people love libraries, they didn't know how to organize and effectively vote for them. At that time, almost all library advocacy programs were 501c3 nonprofits, and under IRS rules, they could educate the public, but they were strictly limited in how much they could lobby or even help people understand how to vote. Enter EveryLibrary's founders, John Kraska, an American Library Association director, and Patrick Sweeney, a California librarian and activist. These two visionaries set out to fix this systemic weakness by creating a 501c4 for the library world. The result was a political action committee that could campaign for ballot measures, lobby legislators, and fight the political attacks that standard library organizations were either too polite or legally restricted to handle. Here is Patrick Sweeney, EveryLibrary's digital director, on his aha moment that ultimately led to EveryLibrary's founding.
So my name is Patrick Sweeney. I am currently the digital director of EveryLibrary. I'm actually a librarian from California. I got my master's in library and information science degree at San Jose University. I was the school librarian at Green Acres Elementary in Santa Cruz for about 2 years. And then I was the library coordinator at a library in Lincoln, California for 3 years after that. What was interesting about that time is I had just graduated library school. I got an amazing job coordinating the opening of a brand new 40,000 square foot library. When I first got there, it was concrete and drywall and not much else. So I got to fill the library with books. I got to hire all the staff. I got to write all the policy. I got to build a website. The original library was a 2,000 square foot library. That was an old Carnegie library that had been run by volunteers for many years. So when I got there, there wasn't a lot in place, and I got to put a lot of the policies and all those kinds of things in place, which was a really exciting time and an amazing job to get right out of library school. Unfortunately, about 6 months after we opened, we were hit really hard by the recession. And the recession hit Lincoln, California pretty hard because it was a rapidly growing community, and it was mostly propped up by building fees instead of property taxes at that time. And of course, all the building stopped once the recession started. And that meant that we had to do huge cuts to the library budget, which was really devastating considering we had just opened. But we had to take 15% furloughs. We had to take furlough days. We had to reduce the hours. We had to lay off half of our staff. It was a really interesting and devastating time, but it was also really eye-opening because I watched the police navigate this recession and the loss of this money and advocate for police services in Lincoln, California. Now, Lincoln hadn't had a violent crime in over 30 years. It was a bedroom community. It's a commuter hub for Sacramento. Not a lot happens. There's almost no crime in Lincoln, California. But the police in Lincoln were at the time one of the best paid police forces in California. We had one of the lowest police to resident ratios in the state. So the police was doing fine, but they fought really hard to not only keep what they had, but also to grow. So they got to keep their cost of living increases. They got to continue to hire police staff. And we all had to take cuts in order to pay for those things. And I thought that was really, really interesting to watch how the police navigated the recession and the budget cuts and the political fights and advocate for themselves. And I realized that nobody had taught me how to advocate for library funding. And in fact, I have a master's degree in library and information science, and nobody taught me how to advocate for library funding, nor did I get any education about where library funding comes from, how to influence it, where my paycheck comes from, where my book budget comes from. Like, I had no idea how any of that worked. And that kind of set me on this path of learning what advocacy really is and what it does and how to do it and how to advocate for libraries in a much more meaningful way. It's really just built on the model of advocacy in politics. So that's what set us down this path of building EveryLibrary, which was formed in 2012. And it was built in response to the recession, largely because prior to the recession, libraries could put something on the ballot, walk away from it, and it would just pass. They didn't have to fight for it. They didn't have to create a ballot committee, work on a voter file, all of those kinds of things. And in fact, libraries didn't know how to do those things. As I said, they didn't teach it in library school. And so there wasn't really a culture of politics within librarianship. And so we created EveryLibrary as a 501c4 to help provide pro bono support to libraries who were going to the voters, libraries who needed to form a ballot committee, do a vote yes campaign, do the get out the vote campaign, all of those kinds of things. Because the library itself can't tell people how to vote. They need to build a ballot committee registered with the state to raise and expend funds for vote yes materials, And so we were able to walk them through that process and do it on a pro bono basis. And that's really how we got our start as an organization.
Patrick, today EveryLibrary does many things. Looking over your website, there are so many rabbit holes one could explore. It's quite rich. So how would you describe the core of what you do?
We, as an organization, our primary focus is funding libraries. So we work with local communities to work on local funding initiatives. And this is primarily around like ballot initiatives, fighting against defunding, things like that, but primarily library ballot initiatives. No other organization does that kind of work. No other organization works on behalf of library funding at the local level in the same way that we do. And so we're able to work with library ballot initiatives around those funding sources. And it's been about $3 billion so far that we've helped libraries secure.
So it's through funding initiatives that you find your core success, not securing grants, which is what I had thought. But it's getting people involved politically on behalf of their local libraries.
Yeah, through local ballot initiatives, through political initiatives. Like 98% of library funding is political in nature. Only about 2% is philanthropic. And so we work on that.
While EveryLibrary spent their first decade focusing on helping libraries win funding at the ballot box and securing billions in tax revenue, they pivoted heavily between 2021 and 2026 to focus on anti-censorship legislation and defending librarians from specific right-wing attacks. In the 14 years since its founding, EveryLibrary has had to evolve from a small crowdfunding campaign into the primary political engine that librarians use to organize legal and legislative counteroffensives. Here's Patrick Sweeney describing just some of the tools and platforms EveryLibrary provides to help people engage and organize against what the majority of Americans see as an encroachment upon our First Amendment rights.
EveryLibrary is different than things like the American Library Association or the state library associations, things like that, because those organizations are profession-facing organizations. They talk to the profession. They talk to librarians. That's their primary focus. And EveryLibrary sort of started out that way in our work supporting libraries who are going to the voters. But because the discussions have shifted into voter engagement, local pieces of legislative policy, legislative changes, state and federal legislative changes, of course, we're seeing stuff around book bans and all those kinds of things. We've really expanded the work that we're doing into those kinds of spaces. One of the things that we're doing is supporting the Florida Freedom to Read Project. And the Florida Freedom to Read Project is a group of citizens who are really upset with the number of book bans that are occurring in Florida. They started with us as just a simple petition campaign. We worked with them, helped them grow. We provide their website. We provide a lot of resources to help them do the work that they're doing. They're doing amazing work at the Florida Freedom to Read Project. They're working with the League of Women's Voters, who did a research report looking at various policies and things that are impacting book bans and libraries in the state. And so we did a webinar with them to broadcast that and help draw attention to the work that they're doing, using our networks and our resources to help bring people to their cause and help them grow their base. And so that's a big part of the work that we do. In fact, we launched a platform called Fight for the First, which is developed as sort of a change.org kind of petition platform where any community who is facing book bans or censorship issues around their school, public, academic, libraries, or anything like that, launch campaigns to help push back against that. So any community who wants to push back against book banning that's happening in their community can launch a campaign on Fight for the First. We'll support it with direct and indirect funding, pro bono consulting, digital tools, resources, a network of individuals who are facing the same issues across the country. We have an Alliance Leaders Network, which are people who are fighting these same issues. They can kind of talk, and then that platform also allows them to put together a petition, send out emails to everybody who signs their petition so they can get people to attend board meetings or, vote for different local or legislators or get people to run for office. And then create events and all kinds of different things. It's all the organizing tools that you need to fight against book bans in your community. That's how that Florida Freedom to Read Project started. And then we also support Texas Freedom to Read, Read Freely, Alabama, Let Utah Read. There's a bunch of those organizations that we help cultivate and support.
And just to give you a grounded example of what these tools that Patrick touches on here look like in action, here's one story from last year that truly impressed me and just might breathe fire into your activist heart. In March of 2025, the New Hampshire House Finance Committee introduced a surprise amendment to eliminate funding for the New Hampshire State Library completely. What made this doubly remarkable was the New Hampshire State Library was an American historic treasure. It was the oldest library in the nation. Without warning or stakeholder input, this draconian budget proposal would have also gutted support and programs for every single library in the state. But EveryLibrary launched a full-scale rapid response campaign, and within 24 hours, lawmakers had reversed course. So this is how EveryLibrary got it done. Within 90 minutes of being alerted to the budget proposal, EveryLibrary launched a complete campaign infrastructure with the following: a dedicated digital action center to defend the New Hampshire State Library budget. They issued a strong, clear media statement that any concerned player could use in their outreach. They sent out direct email alerts to their in-state supporters, and they distributed a rapid response toolkit to local library stakeholders. They also deployed thousands of dollars in targeted digital ads on social media to mobilize as many Granite Staters as possible before the upcoming vote. And finally, They leveraged the power of community by reaching out to networking partners across the state like New Hampshire Moms Rising, asking them to mobilize their powerful network of members, which they did, quickly sending out the call to action as well as putting out creative outreach on TikTok and social media. All of this converged to this threat to the state library budget being covered by WMUR and In Depth New Hampshire, helping bring statewide visibility to the issue. The impact was immediate, unmistakable, and powerful. In less than 24 hours, more than 4,400 people used EveryLibrary's platform to contact their state legislators. The surge of public outcry was impossible to ignore, and again, the House Finance Committee had reversed course, and the proposal to defund and dismantle the New Hampshire State Library was withdrawn. EveryLibrary's response systems have been built over years so that we don't have to sit by and watch helplessly as ridiculous political maneuvers dismantle our library and information systems. So, Patrick, as we start looking forward into what EveryLibrary is confronting today, as the political terrain rapidly evolves and devolves, can you give us an overview of the biggest challenges since Trump regained office?
This last year has been pretty wild. In 2025, Trump eliminated the director of the Library of Congress, the director of the National Archives, the director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And this year, it seems like the attacks are a little bit more state level and localized. I mean, there's nobody else for Trump to fire at the federal level. So.
Right. And from what I've read, Trump installed his loyalists into these vacated positions, people who are, not surprisingly, unqualified for running these important institutions.
There are people who have zero experience working in that space. They have zero experience around the National Archives. They have zero experience around the Library of Congress. Jordan Sonnenberg is running the IMLS, and now Trump is taking that money from the IMLS to do things that are named Trump, basically. And so there's the money that IMLS is receiving is funding Freedom Trucks, which are these trucks that promote America for our 250th anniversary. But they're really a tool to put out talking points that are very Trumpian in nature. And then also there's some big grants that are going out that are specifically named after Trump and stuff like that. So
2025 was a rough year, a wild year, as you said. It must be exhausting.
I mean, I think it was a breath in the scope of the attacks in 2025, the attacks on libraries. It happened at the federal level, it happened at the state level, and it happened at the local level. We are seeing just a broad spectrum of attacks as libraries get caught up in this sort of culture war. What's interesting is that a lot of the executive orders that he's pushed have been overturned in the courts because the executive branch doesn't have jurisdiction over funding IMLS, Library of Congress, NARA, like those kinds of things. Congress makes those decisions. Trump can't just unilaterally make a decision with executive order, even though he tried. So a lot of those executive orders were nullified in the courts, and he lost a lot of those fights simply because of that judicial process, right? So that's where a lot of those kinds of wins happen. He didn't try to completely just eliminate IMLS as an institution, but again, he didn't have jurisdiction to do that anyway.
Well, it's nice to know that there were some wins in the courts and Congress that actually can and should be celebrated. I want to dig a little deeper into the impact of those firings you discussed and what people can do about it, but let's take a moment to reintroduce the show. This is the Apocalyptic Supperclub, where I serve up stories to whet the appetite for the politically possible and show how ordinary people can be a part of creating big change. Our show today features the work of EveryLibrary, an organization that helps people build political power to fund and defend our libraries. When we come back, we'll have more from EveryLibrary's co-founder Patrick Sweeney on how working to preserve our library institutions strengthens democracy and saves Americans hundreds of millions of dollars annually. This is the Apocalyptic Supperclub, sharing stories to help ordinary people see and know how they can be a part of creating big change. Our libraries are under attack like never before. If you love libraries, and most people do, there is a role you can play to champion the role they play in our culture. And to help you do this is EveryLibrary, a 501c4 social welfare organization that delivers pro bono resources, tools, and coaching to help communities, and now the nation, fund and defend our library institutions, both large and small. Donald Trump has sought to eliminate the Institute of Museum and Library Services in every budget he has delivered to Congress. Ostensibly, it is to save us money. But let's take a look at what the IMLS does for the American people. Here's Patrick Sweeney, co-founder of EveryLibrary.
The Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is the only federal funding source for libraries and museums. That funding typically funds things around like interlibrary loan. It funds things around one-time costs that libraries typically can't pay for using their local taxes. So new roofs, new HVAC systems, construction, all that infrastructure kind of stuff. And then grants that fund services to vets programs or services to the blind, services for the deaf at the state library level, things like that. So why does the federal government fund local libraries? Well, because local library taxes can't be used on a number of things. Like, it's really hard to move tax money from one jurisdiction to another. You know, the police can't just take money from the library or from the school district or vice versa. There's laws and rules against that. Dallas can't take tax money from Houston, you know. So when there are programs that in scope are beyond like one taxing jurisdiction, like interlibrary loan is a great example of that. Like, the reason that you can go to any library in this country and have them send a book to you from any other library in this country is because of interlibrary loan, which is funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Service, LSTA money, specifically to solve that problem of moving money across those taxing jurisdictions, right? Also, local taxes are really good about ongoing costs, but they aren't good about one-time occurrences. So if the roof leaks, if computer software goes out of date, if like those kinds of things happen, that kind of LSTA, Library Services and Technology Act, that tech money that's funded largely at the federal level through the states, comes down and filters in and does those kind of stopgap measures. And what it also does is it saves taxpayers, immeasurable amounts of money, because it allows libraries to make bulk orders from library vendors as a group instead of as an individual library. So not every single library, like in a lot of states, the databases that libraries offer are bought at the state level, and libraries are provided with them through that federal LSTA money that comes through the states. And they're able to bargain because they're bargaining a bigger contract. If every single library individually bought that database from the database company, it would be exponentially more expensive, and it would cost taxpayers a lot more money. A lot of the book purchasing is done that way. A lot of the digital books are done that way. Ebooks are done that way. A lot of those kinds of programs that come down through the state significantly reduce the cost to taxpayers, far more than IMLS costs them. And so when people come in and they say, well, we're just going to start cutting things that don't make sense to us. Well, it doesn't make sense to you because you haven't done the research on it. You know, you haven't looked at how this actually functions and how this actually saves taxpayers millions and millions of dollars.
Let's break down what Patrick said here and get a bit granular. The annual budget for the Institute of Museum and Library Services is approximately $290 million. But just to be conservative, let's round up to $300 million. That $300 million from the IMLS acts as a financial catalyst that allows states to pool their resources and engage in collective bargaining through state library cooperatives and digital consortia funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Here's one example that should be clarifying. The most significant savings for local and university libraries occur through grants to states that use part of their IMLS funding to buy statewide licenses for academic databases and e-book platforms. If every local library or school district bought these licenses individually, the cost would be astronomical, For example, a single high-end database might cost a small library $5,000 to $10,000 per year. But by purchasing one license for the entire state, the cost per library drops to a few $100s or less. This is the beauty of collective bargaining, and industry experts estimate that statewide purchasing consortia anchored by IMLS funds saves local taxpayers between 70 and 90% compared to individual retail pricing. While the Institute of Museum and Library Services receives that $300 million, its role in enabling states to act as a single buyer likely saves the American public over $1 billion annually in costs that would otherwise fall on your local property taxes. So when these right-wing politicians claim to be saving you money by urging cuts to federal programs like the IMLS, do you think this adds up? If you stop doing repairs on your house today, well, it will save you money in the immediate term, but it won't stop your house from falling into ruin. While EveryLibrary does not represent the IMLS, they are constantly at the ready to alert their members about campaigns related to it so people can rapidly respond, and it works. Even though trying to undermine our libraries and information systems is high on the right-wing authoritarian agenda, people's voices still matter. Case in point, even though Donald Trump has sought to defund and dismantle the IMLS every year he has been in office, our Republican-controlled Congress has refused his demands, and it even increased IMLS funding this year because they know their constituents value their library systems. They know their local universities depend on those databases. They know there is a price to be paid for defunding these systems, and one way they are consistently reminded is through the voices empowered by organizations like EveryLibrary. So I asked Patrick, if the IMLS saves us so much money, why is Donald Trump seeking to cut such a cost-saving measure?
I don't think he cares one way or another, honestly. The organizations like Heritage, Cato Institute, like those kinds of organizations have been trying to defund the Institute of Museum and Library Services since 2004. 2006,
And their purpose is
anti-tax, anti-government. This is all just part of like the anti-tax, anti-government kind of stuff. Government's bloated, it's bureaucratic. Why is the federal government paying for local libraries? Which I think are always legitimate questions to ask, as long as you listen to the answer.
Patrick, you mentioned the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute being among the drivers to defund and destroy these institutions. And although there are people who believe in the ideas they espouse, it still shocks me that their ideas are gaining such traction.
So I think a couple of things there. Number one, if you look at the data that we have around who supports libraries, the moderate majority of Americans, whether they're on the left or the right side of politics, support libraries. What we're hearing from are these really loud outliers, and that's what we're hearing from the most. In fact, the people who are fighting to ban books, they make up about 8% of the American public. And in fact, there's an article from 2023 or 24, 11 people made up 60% of the book banning in the country. This all makes sense if you understand that politics only functions around radicalized individuals. If you are so on the whales, if you're like, whales are fine, you're not going to get on the boat. But if you're like, whales are my thing, I love whales are the best thing in the world, you're the guy who's going to get on the boat, right? And the reason that we're seeing such radicalized language around things like libraries and other things is because that engages the radicalized parts of society who are the ones who make donations, the ones who show up to city council meetings, the ones who sign petitions, the ones who volunteer, the ones who take all those kinds of actions to influence all that power, the political power in the country, right? And so once you start thinking about that, like why are they calling librarians pedophiles and groomers? Because that's nonsense. Like almost nobody believes that. It's less than 8% of the public that believe librarians are pedophiles and groomers. So why are they saying it if such a small minority? Well, the small minority that believes it, believe it. And they are the ones who are going to take up the mantle and fight on behalf and be loud and be crazy and do the nonsense things that gain the attention that they need in order to put the people that they want in positions of power and influence, elect the people that they want, raise the money that they need in order to elect the people that they want. So this is all part of a much larger puzzle. Libraries are a very small part of it, but I think they're a very important part of it because they're being so loud about it. And the reason that libraries are being attacked again is because they can't defend themselves, and that's the kind of people that we're dealing with. The people who don't care about the morality of it, the people who don't care about the right or the wrong of it, the people who just want to profit, see themselves in power, or gain power and influence over the American people. And I think this is just a part of that infrastructure.
It turns out Patrick is right. The attack on libraries is part of a bigger puzzle, a systemic perfect storm that is creating an infrastructure of vulnerability and destabilization of something we all thought we could take for granted: the library, a quiet place where quiet, smart librarians help you discover the world, find answers, or help you use an invaluable database. For decades, libraries were seen as one of the few remaining neutral civic spaces where voluntary discovery was the culture. But now they have become cultural battlegrounds and perceived budget drains where differing factions are converging to put their claws into a rather defenseless institution. And removing funding is now the preferred method of destruction. We are witnessing a tipping point feedback loop where long-standing fiscal pressures have collided with a new, highly organized ideological movement. Many elected officials categorize libraries as a community amenity like a park, rather than an essential service like water or the police. And this reframes the library as an optional luxury rather than a public requirement. Additionally, there is a persistent myth among some local officials that everything is on the internet now, leading to the argument that physical libraries are an obsolete expense. This ignores the fact that libraries are now primary hubs for high-speed internet access, job applications, and social services for the elderly and unhoused. Combine these fiscal pressures with the white Christian nationalist movement that has been slowly building power for decades. Leaders within the movement understand how important it is to control the narrative, especially as children are developing. It is a much more convincing argument to state, we are protecting children from obscenity and pain, than to proclaim, we are controlling what our children can even contemplate as true. In many areas, if a library is framed as a purveyor of obscenity, it becomes politically easier for a city council to argue that tax dollars should not support it. This shift from banning books to legislatively defunding libraries is unfortunately a brilliant tactical move. Defunding the institution and firing the board is more permanent, and it allows officials to avoid lawsuits. Because if a library is closed for budgetary reasons, it's harder to sue for First Amendment violations than if a book is explicitly censored. And it moves the power of what information is available from trained librarians to elected politicians. Luckily, the answer to all these complicated issues is always the same. Get involved, organize communally, and engage with clear strategies that build towards solid ends. And here, Patrick Sweeney shares what EveryLibrary helped people accomplish last year and why it is important that those who care radicalize their love of freedom and translate it into action.
We've been incredibly busy. We did help launch 14 state-level organizations that were community members who are tired of book bans and that kind of stuff in their communities. So 14 different states. We have worked with over 120 local communities who are fighting against book bans and censorship in their local communities and providing resources and structures and stuff like that to help them navigate that. Ultimately, I think the biggest problem is that so many people think that librarians are going to fight these fights on the public's behalf. And librarians are really restricted on what they can do politically. They're government employees on government time, using government resources. They can't create petitions. They can't tell people who to vote for. They can't advocate on their own behalf. They don't have advocacy budgets, even if they wanted to, or they don't have marketing budgets, even if they wanted to. So librarians are really unarmed against these attacks. We need people to stand up and start fighting back. We've built the tools to help people do that, fund libraries, fightforthefirst.org, like those kinds of tools where people can launch petitions or raise money for local advocacy campaigns and really bring this down to like a grassroots community organizing level.
What I loved hearing you say is that it really needs to come down to people organizing and acting, and every library is here to help people do that. Let's talk about that a little further. So you said the big challenges of 2025 were just things coming at you from every direction, and you named some pretty successful campaigns. Could you name one or two that really lit you up or make the organization feel really proud of what they're doing?
Oh, yeah. We're able to raise money for a couple of libraries that had been defunded at the local level. I mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars, like over $150,000 to a couple of libraries that had been defunded. But that happened, 2 or 3 times, I think, in 2025, where the city council just were like, well, we're not going to pay for this library anymore if you don't, whatever, with these books. The books were almost never in the libraries themselves, not books that the school libraries carried or the public libraries carried or whatever, or they weren't in the sections that they were saying they were. This is all just manufactured outrage stuff. But they were withholding funds about a lot of these books. And then we were able to go in and raise money from across the country to help fund these libraries and keep their doors open and serving their public. And I think those are the ones that I'm most proud of. There were quite a few wins where we kept the books on the shelf, where we were able to rally the community and get people to stand up and take action. And I think all of that is well and good. But long term, what's going to happen is people are going to have to run for office. We're going to need people to stand up, show up, and run for office on a pro-library agenda, or at least have being pro-library as part of their platform. And that's really, I think, the only long-term solution to this problem. And people don't realize, I think 70% of elected positions run unopposed, 70%. And there's like some crazy positions out there. I'm not saying everybody has to run for city council or county commission, but here where I live, there's a register of wills, and the register of wills makes over $105,000 plus benefits and retirement. I mean, that's a solid amount of money. A lot of these positions run unopposed. And if we can get people into offices, get them used to running for office, get them elected on that pro-library agenda, I think that's the way that we actually do win in the long term. Like all those short-term wins, all those one-time wins, they're really nice. And I'm super proud of them. But I really want to see us win in the long term. I want to see, libraries exist 20, 30 years from now, not just win what happened in 2025. So there's a lot of tools to do it. Run for Something is a great organization that gets young people, new people who never run for office before, run for office. There's a platform called Nation Builder that has a platform called runforoffice.org. You can look up your address and you can see a position that is open to run. But every library doesn't do anything with candidates. I want to make that clear. Like, we don't endorse candidates. We don't fund candidates. We do encourage people to run for office if they have pro-libraries as part of their agenda. So I do want to make sure that we make that distinction. But yeah, long term, that's our way out.
This is the Apocalyptic Supperclub, where I serve up stories to nourish your capacity to show up more fully in dire times. My guest is Patrick Sweeney, co-founder of EveryLibrary, a public service organization that empowers people to defend libraries and librarians with strategic pro bono resources that have helped communities across the nation to secure billions in funding and stand up for their First Amendment rights. Coming up next, what starts in Texas won't stay in Texas. How what's happening to libraries in the Lone Star State matters in your state, too. This is the Apocalyptic Supperclub, and I am your host, Christine Barrington. My guest is Patrick Sweeney, co-founder of EveryLibrary, a groundbreaking nonprofit in the world of library advocacy that provides entire suites of digital tools, web platforms, and strategic political consulting to individuals and communities who feel called to rise up and stare down the avalanche of anti-library legislation rolling across the nation and threatening not only our First Amendment rights, but also the invaluable services libraries provide to our communities. I asked Patrick what he sees coming down the line in 2026.
Yeah, I think that, Trump is going to definitely try and defund IMLS once again in 2026. I think it's going to be completely dependent upon how the midterms go. If he does lose Congress, then these kinds of things are going to be safe. If he gets more power in Congress, we are going to see Congress decide to fund IMLS less and not take a stand against when these kinds of things are happening, right? So, I mean, that's at the federal level. At the state level, we're going to continue to see tons of legislation coming down around arresting librarians, just like we're seeing this year. Like in Iowa, they're trying to get rid of the bookmobiles, which is preposterous. Like bookmobiles are just kind of magical things to begin with. Being against bookmobiles just doesn't make any sense. We're going to see a lot of these highly restrictive pieces of legislation around what books can be purchased. At the local level, I think we're really going to see library boards installed and appointed by city councils and county commissions that are specifically installed and appointed in order to defund the library from the inside as just part of their goal. We're seeing that in a lot of different places, Rutherford County.
And one of those places is Texas. Earlier, Patrick mentioned supporting the Texas Freedom to Read project. This is a small group of folks doing big work because, well, everything in Texas is big, right? This is especially true when it comes to strategic maneuvering to end libraries as we know them. Texas is currently experiencing a main character moment in American life. It is no longer just a large state with a lot of oil. It has become a primary exporter of American identity, economic trends, and political friction. Texas is exporting governance through its legislature and court system, and we all should be paying attention. Texas is in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is one of the most conservative in the United States, and its recent ruling, Little versus Llano County, sets a precedent which should send shivers through every library-loving heart. The Fifth Circuit majority ruled that public library patrons have no constitutional First Amendment right to receive information in a public library. The concurring opinion went further and held that libraries' decisions about which books to keep or remove are government speech and therefore immune from constitutional challenge. Even more alarming is that the United States Supreme Court chose not to take up Little versus Llano County, allowing the decision of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals to stand. According to the Texas Freedom to Read project, this decision is of grave concern for the future of libraries and the freedom to read across this country because under this precedent, which could spread, whoever holds the political power now decides what goes on library shelves. Returning to Patrick's view forward in 2026, he circled back around to the power of citizens and the choices they do have to become real drivers for solidifying our constitutional rights in the face of just these kinds of power grabs.
I think that there is a really big risk to losing federal funding for libraries and these networks and consortiums and things that allow us to save money. I think all of that is very much at risk this time around. I'm optimistic that the courts can claw some of it back. I am optimistic that'll happen, but it's not going to happen unless people work to do it. Like they're not going to claw that stuff back unless we can get the resources in place to do that. Ensuring that the public stays informed and doesn't give up and keeps pushing and keeps fighting back. Because we also know that the majority of Americans disagree with a lot of what's happening right now. They're worried and out of steam to keep fighting.
So how do you think the exhaustion and the need for action gets reconciled?
My big recommendation to people right now is to find a cause that they care about and stick with it and fight for it. It's so easy to get distracted by the 10,000 things that are happening right this second. It's so easy to be worried about everything. You can't impact everything. You can't do everything. But if you focus on something that you can do, focus in one specific area. If you are passionate about, saving the North Atlantic spotted chinchilla or whatever, like focus on that, fight for that, whatever you're passionate about. If you're focused on fighting for libraries, coming to us, launching campaigns, statewide initiatives, local chapters, we can work you through that whole process. We can step you through it. Also, a lot of people don't realize how much power they actually have, especially at the local level. Local community organizing is so important right now. Running for office is so incredibly important right now. A lot of people don't realize that you can put stuff on the ballot to shape your community the way you want it. these local fights is really where it's happening. Like a lot of people don't realize that the political environment that we're fighting at the state and federal level is stemming from the Great Recession and the Tea Party movement. One of the things that the Tea Party movement, which was very anti-government, anti-tax, very Christian nationalist in its origins, that started by working to get local people elected to lower offices in local politics. I mean, everything from dog catcher to sheriff to judge to whatever. People who are running at the state and federal level typically come from local offices first. Like they don't just jump onto the national scene out of nowhere. They were usually like a city council person somewhere, and then they were a state senator somewhere, and then they moved on to becoming a federal legislator. And so the people who we're seeing at the state and federal level right now are the people who ran for office, 2010, 11, 12, as part of the Tea Party movement and got trained during the Tea Party movement and now have those ideologies at the state and federal level. So like these local politics do matter. Getting involved locally matters. Running initiatives on the things that you care matter. You can get things on the ballot on a bunch of different ways to shape your community. And if it's around libraries, we're here to support that kind of work.
Patrick, thank you again for stressing the choices we have for empowered action. This has all just become such a battleground. And one of the most embattled players today are our librarians. What are you seeing around this in your role at EveryLibrary?
I talk to librarians all the time who are in tears, who are scared, who are crying. They're getting bomb threats at libraries. They are getting bullets mailed to them. They are being stalked. They are being attacked on their way to their car. We have people who are in full tactical gear, bulletproof vests, open carry, going into libraries and screaming at the librarians and threatening librarians just for doing their jobs. I mean, this is, I think, one of the most upsetting things that's happening in this country. Like, we've never seen any country in all of history that had good things start to happen after they began arresting librarians. That's always led down a very dark path, like arresting librarians and educators for reading books and educating children. Like that's always led to something very, very dark. And so when we're seeing all of these moves to make it legally allowable to arrest librarians for the books on the shelf, that gets very dark and very scary, I think, really quickly. And the way it's being presented to the public is well, we're just removing exemptions to the law so that librarians aren't exempt from obscenity laws. And the reason, though, that librarians are exempt from obscenity laws isn't because they want to push porn in libraries. It's because they have books that have pictures of Michelangelo's David, which, under the law, the way these are being written, would be considered pornography. I mean, we're seeing it over and over and over again that, they hold up 3 or 4 books as examples of pornography, which, if you read the books, or the books go under a review board that's required to read the books before they remove them from the library, they find out that the book does not qualify for obscenity under the Miller test. It is not an obscene book. In fact, the book teaches children how not to get groomed, how not to be sexually assaulted, how not to be abused, how to report sexual abuse and assault from people in positions of power and influence, how to protect themselves. Even the books like the 3 or 4 books that they're holding up pornography, when you actually read them and see the images or the text in context, it means something wildly, wildly different. And so there isn't a case where there is pornography in libraries, especially not as defined by law in the Miller test. But this removal of protections for librarians around obscenity is terrifying because of what a lot of people are considering to be obscene.
This would be an opportune time to jump in and explain the Miller test, also called the 3-prong obscenity test, which is the United States Supreme Court's test for determining whether speech or expression can be labeled obscene, in which case it is not protected by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution and can be prohibited. The Miller test was developed in 1973 in a case called Miller versus California, and it has 3 parts. 1. If the average person applying contemporary community standards finds that the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest. 2. whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct or excretory functions specifically defined by applicable state law, and 3, whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. The work then is considered obscene only if all 3 conditions are satisfied. And now back to Patrick Sweeney, who's trying to explain how average Americans across the country are trying to bend these obscenity laws to fit their interpretations.
And in fact, it is saying that if a parent simply finds a book to be obscene, that the librarian can be arrested. We've had people tell us that there's a video of a woman from Moms for Liberty in Wisconsin screaming about a book at a school board meeting and screaming about how it's obscene and anybody who's giving this to children should be arrested. And the book is a scientific book about seahorses. And the problem that she had with it is that the male and female seahorse intertwine their tails. And that was too sexual for her children, she felt. And so librarians should be arrested because seahorses intertwine their tails. Like, that's preposterous. There's books like In the Night Kitchen or I Hate Unicorns. I think there's a Goblin Butt in I Hate Unicorns that people had a problem with. There's Walter the Farting Dog, which they've called obscene. It's a really funny book about a dog that farts. And librarians would be arrested for a lot of these books.
It's been pretty shocking to see the level of harassment these librarians are receiving, but I wonder how much people actually realize they are suffering and fearing arrests.
Yeah. And in fact, like, people say, oh, you're being hyperbolic, that's not even going to happen or whatever. Well, we know it's already happened. We know people are already targeting librarians to arrest them. And the thing you have to remember, like, the average age of librarians is somewhere around 48, and 80% of it is female. So we're talking about like 40, 50-year-old women who are sitting behind the desk and have very large men from very violent groups come in, fully armed, screaming at them. Like, they're just primarily middle-aged women who want to see kids read. That's the majority of our industry. It's just wild.
How much help do you see coming forward for these beleaguered librarians?
Not a lot. Not a lot. This is an interesting time in that some librarian is definitely going to get hurt in a real serious, major way. Something truly horrific happening. We need Americans to stand up to this. Like, this isn't what this country is about. This isn't what we want to see happen. This isn't good. If you're religious, this isn't Christian-like. And so we need people to stand up, talk about, and take action and support libraries. Show your librarians some love. Show them some kindness. Give them some praise, because they're in a really terrifying position right now.
And so I want to ask, how are you all doing at EveryLibrary?
Emotionally?
Yeah.
This is really, really hard. I was a librarian for many years. So a lot of the people that I'm seeing get attacked are close personal friends. I'm talking to librarians who are getting bomb threats to libraries and stuff like that. And those are the librarians that I'm talking to, a lot of which are my friends, who, again, I've known since I began in libraries back in 2006. So it's really emotionally draining. It is very difficult to talk to all these people all the time about all the bad things that are happening to libraries across the country, especially just knowing how unaware the American public is about how much worse it is for librarians than they realize.
So what is it like for you all when people show up?
Seeing some of the communities that show up has been the really inspirational part. Texas Freedom to Read, Florida Freedom to Read. If you look them up, like, we help them stand up their websites and train them and organize them. And seeing these community members who have no real connection to libraries. They're not librarians. They're not library workers. But they just simply believe that people should have the right to read, or that children should be able to see themselves in the books that they're reading in the libraries. And those kinds of things has been, just incredibly inspirational. It's the part that keeps me going. Back before 2020, it was me and our executive director at our kitchen tables doing this work. We've been able to expand in the last 5 years. We have a number of staff members, and being able to have that support system and talk to other people and not just be so isolated. Especially now when this is a very dark and scary time for so many, friends and people I know personally, that it's incredibly helpful to have that support network.
One way to support librarians is to understand what they are going through at this moment. According to the School Library Journal, nearly a quarter of all school librarians have experienced harassment over books, and many are leaving the profession. Despite the pressure, librarians are winning significant battles through collective action and new freedom to read laws. In Texas, a group of librarians founded the Freedom Fighters, one of the first groups that are moving from defending books to training librarians on how to handle harassment and providing a battle kit for those in states where legislative help has not yet arrived. And in 70 of the 87 school districts PEN America identified as having bans in place, local librarians have joined with parents and students to fight back, and many of these people were supported by EveryLibrary. So, Patrick, I think people might feel really impressed with everything that EveryLibrary is doing. And if they want to join up or help out, what should they do?
Yeah, if you want to help us support libraries, if you go to everylibrary.org/donate, you can make a donation there to help us support libraries. It doesn't cost much to support libraries. It doesn't cost a lot. We could fund every library ballot initiative in this country with just $1 million. That's all it would take. If you're in a position to be able to give or start a monthly donation of just $1, $3, or $5, that's usually appreciated. And that brings in a lot of money to libraries. So I would love to see that. If you are facing book bans or challenges, please feel free to reach out. You can launch a campaign on Fight for the First, and we will get in contact with you and walk you through the process. If you are working to support your local library in some way, please reach out to us. All of our support is pro bono. You don't have to pay us. We're not paid political consultants or paid political operatives. We're just here to support you and your fight for your local library. So anything we can do to help, don't be afraid to reach out to us.
Libraries and librarians have always been champions of high-quality reasoning based on knowledge, and this is one of the reasons they are under fire. If you feel called to engage, you can take advantage of the incredible free resources EveryLibrary offers. Links to their website and all the resources mentioned in the show can be found in our show notes. Thanks to Patrick Sweeney, and thank you for joining me on the Apocalyptic Supper Club. I hope you have been fed inspiration and nourishing resources to help you know that you can be a part of big change in dire times. This show was produced in partnership with KSQD Radio on California's Central Coast. Music was Dire Ghost from Blue Dot Sessions and Hopeful Journey from Pixabay. I am Christine Barrington. For articles, links, and podcasts to inspire and nourish your inner citizen, visit apocalypticsupperclub.com.